Good evening all and welcome. In tonight's video we're going to be heading into the woods for a collection of creepy stories. Don't forget that we also have an app that you can download to listen to lots of stories ad-free. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already for even more terrifying stories every week. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. The village I lived in only housed about 40 to 50 people at most. Everyone knew everyone. All 12 of us kids knew each other and played with each other. Naturally, some of us grouped together and explored the surrounding areas, since there wasn't much to do in the way of entertainment back in the mid-90s in rural Ohio. The village was old. The furthest back I could find about the village documentation-wise was that it was established in the late 1790s as a small trading hub for the local area. Ohio didn't become a state until 1803. My village had a single church in the middle of it, an old schoolhouse converted into an actual house just next to it, and pasture behind it, with thick woods surrounding 3 of the 4 sides of the small town. My dad actually grew up in this area. He used to have lots of legends and stories about it. It was originally French, turned British, and finally colonial American in the area. No one really knew exactly where it was, but there were a few mentions of a small fort in the area from the research I had done. One of these stories about the fort was that it was a primary trade route for the local native tribes and the influx of settlers that were arriving in the area. Naturally, conflicts arose as more and more of the people settled in the surrounding area, and eventually all-out conflict ensued between the settlers and the native tribes. The fort was said to be destroyed by fire. People on both sides slaughtered each other, and eventually the natives were driven from the area with the help of a local militia. My dad always told me the land wasn't good, tainted in ways with bad energy. I guess when entire families are slaughtered and people are being driven from their homeland, it can cause some long-term ill effects. When all of us kids were playing, we were always told 2 things. The first is if the woods get too quiet, you get quiet and leave immediately. 2, if your name is being called out and you're way out in the woods, do not respond. Go home immediately and never look back. Pretend you never heard it to begin with. Everyone in the village knew how quirky the area was. Most days were the usual bland days, while some days it was like a fairy tale. Periodically, other days it could be a nightmare. Now the people of the woods were probably the most common entity everyone in the village knew of, and were generally treated with respect and a wide berth. Some of the other things were generally best left well enough alone. Now for my experience. In the late 90s, I was around 10 years old, when I was overcome with an insatiable desire to go camping. It was mid-August, hot and muggy during the day, but rather mild and cool at night. I gathered 2 of my friends and told them about it, and they both liked the idea. Now, generally no one really camped in our woods. My parents, along with many others, really just didn't like the idea of a group of 10 and 11-year-olds going camping alone. My dad said we could, as long as he came with us to ensure we were safe. We reluctantly agreed. Prior to that night, I went out to scout out a good area to make camp at, and I knew of a fairly decent place that was close to the creek, relatively flat and not too difficult to get to. I wanted to scout the area just to ensure it was clear of debris and ready for tents. By this time, I was well acquainted with the people of the woods, and I made my offering before entering. I didn't see them all on my journey or anything, so I felt pretty good about that. Once I arrived to the location, I began moving things around, clearing out the sticks, large stones, and making a fire pit, even going as far as to stocking it with wood and throwing some larger sticks nearby for fuel for later. I was so enthralled with what I was doing, and so focused in getting the area cleaned, that by the time I was satisfied with what I had done, I only just noticed how quiet everything around me became. When I say quiet, I mean dead silent. No birds, bugs, not even the wind made a noise amongst the leaf litter. I immediately shut down everything I was doing. I stood there looking around slowly, just breathing and trying to listen for the faintest sound I could. I don't know how long I stood there motionless, a few minutes maybe, and then in the far distance I could hear a crow call, and almost immediately I began to hear the chirping of robins and even a faint whistling from the wind in the trees. The hair on my arm and neck were on end, and I figured, well, maybe it was just me making a ruckus, and that everything nearby quietened down because of it. Content with the logical reasoning, I began to make my way back home and pack up for the night. Around 6 p.m., my two friends made their way over with their backpacks, tents, and both me and my dad were finishing up dinner. All four of us made ready with everything we needed and began trekking out to the site I prepared. Nothing all that noteworthy happened going to the site, even after setting up our tents, lighting the fire, and making s'mores. It was snapping up to be a pretty fun night and rather enjoyable. Once we started getting ready to crawl into our tents for the night at around 10 to 11, the wind began to pick up, and my dad said that we might be in for some rain, but he didn't seem to have a look of contentment on his face when he said that, which was weird as he loved the rain. It was like he felt that something was off, and it wasn't before long the rest of us started feeling that way too. We all ended up crawling in our tents anyway, since it was night. And possible rain incoming trekking back home would have sucked. We should have walked back. We situated our tents in a half circle around the fire pit, which all were facing the creek, and the back of the tents facing the woodline. My dad was to the left of me in his military surplus tent, and me in my cheapo Walmart single-person tent, just barely large enough for me and my two friends to the right in their own. The wind howled for some time. Half an hour to an hour before it calmed down, it got quiet. No crickets, no wind, no wildlife. The creek itself, which usually bubbles happily along, sounded muted. All we had was the faint glow of embers from the fire pit in front of our tents casting a warm glow. I could hear my heart throb in my ears, and I knew my dad and two friends were just as anxious as I was, as I could hear them shift uncomfortably. I heard one of my friend's tent zippers and naturally undid my own to see what was going on. As soon as I popped my head out to look, I saw my dad come out of his tent with the machete he had, and he faced the woodline. My friend had his head poking out too and asked if I heard the noise. I didn't hear anything. My heart was pounding so hard, it was hard hearing him even whisper. We both partially got out of the tent to see what my dad was looking at, but all we could see was inky darkness. And then I heard it. A distant and faint, "Hello?" It was coming from some ways away in the darkness of the woods. I could see my dad shift uncomfortably on his feet, white-knuckled, his machete looking to the tree line. Then again, the voice called out, "Hello?" It didn't seem right. It was off-putting, almost as if whoever was speaking was trying to speak in a very feminine voice, faint and fragile. My dad motioned me to grab some of the extra wood next to his tent and throw it on the fire, which I reluctantly did. Leaving the perceived safety of my tent didn't sit well with me. As the fire began to slowly grow in brightness, my dad stepped back, near the fire, and stood there facing the woodline. By this time, my other friend popped his head out of his tent too, and all three of us, including my dad, were watching the woodline, unsure what to expect. Nothing came out, and we didn't hear the voice again. An hour passed by, and this time my dad was sitting on a large stone next to his tent, one leg crossed and a machete in his right hand, watching silently, only the sound of crackling fire echoing against the shale cliff face across the creek. Several hours passed, and both of my friends went back to their tents. Only me and my dad were out. Me tending the fire, and my dad watching and waiting. I could hear rustling to our right, just beyond the line of fire in the tree line. My friend closest to it popped his head out, looked at me and asked, "What?" as if he wanted me to repeat what I'd just said, but I hadn't said a word. I put my finger up to my lips and motioned to be quiet. By the time I did so, my dad was standing next to me and told us both to shush, and immediately we hear someone say, "Come here," in that same off-putting feminine voice. All three of us just stood there, peering in the direction of where the voice came from, and shortly after we heard what sounded like something move back, deeper into the woods. It didn't sound heavy. It sounded light, like something lightly trotting back. That was the last time we heard it. Shortly after, I'm assuming early morning, just before daybreak, the wood life returned. Crickets, the distant chirp of the birds, and the whispers from the wind through the leaves. Once daybreak came, we all broke down our tents, packed up, and began hiking back home. We were paranoid the entire way back, stopping and listening and looking. We didn't see nor hear anything nor anyone. Nobody said a word on the way back. Once we reached my backyard, my dad broke the silence and told us what we experienced never happened, and it would do us good to not say a word of it to anyone. He had fear written all over his face, as if not even he had ever experienced anything like that. To this day, I don't know what or who it was. I did end up asking my aunt next door later in life, and she experienced something similar when she grew up in the area too, but even she was tight-lipped about it, saying we shouldn't have gone camping out there and my dad was a fool for letting us go. I have since left my village and moved out of state, but I have run into similar stories down here in the southeast with the same reluctance to explain what it was or could be. If anyone could enlighten me, I'm all ears. Growing up with my dad has also taught me to be very respectful of others and their cultures. He's a retired Marine, ever since he joined with the delayed entry program when he was 16, up until he retired at age 40. He's been raised like a Marine. Marines are Marines. Each one of them is a devil dog just like the next. They don't care about race, color, religion. All they care about is you. And at the end of the day, will put on the same uniform as them and do your duties. My dad has seen it all. He served and was stationed in many places around the world. Nicaragua, Okinawa, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, and bits of pieces of those places have always stayed with him. My dad, of course, never ever forgot that. He raised us to be mindful of others, to respect and honor our culture, but to not treat anyone unfairly just because theirs is different. I wouldn't say my dad is a superstitious person. He likes to be cautious and prepared, but I wouldn't say it crossed the line of superstition. He also told us ghost stories and stories of the war that had been exaggerated and built upon for entertainment value. But there was one story he never changed. He never told it to make it sound fun or extra spooky. He just told us the story he heard exactly at face value. It was the story of one of his friends in the Marines. He was native, and he told my father about an encounter he had with a certain creature from native folklore. Anyone who's relatively versed in native folklore should know exactly what I'm talking about, but please forgive that I don't want to say the name. He always told the story as a warning, and to let us know that even though the culture we were being raised in might not believe it, there were cultures that did, and that the place we lived in is home to those cultures. Knowing this, me and my siblings always do our best to be as respectful as we can. I live in the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley. In my state, we have plenty of nature and state parks, fitted with lakes, campgrounds, hiking trails and docks, the whole 9 yards and then some. This area is home to many native tribes, such as the Miami, the Erie, the Shawnee, and the Iroquois people, and many others. Because of this, you'll find many people who are aware and respectful of Native Americans and their cultures. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of redneck hillbilly gunslinging Americans who don't give a damn who you are or where you're from, but I've noticed a lot of people in my area tend to be very respectful. But for now, on to the story. My dad and I like to do physical training together. We especially love going to do it on the hiking trails. That's what we were doing today. We drove out to a nearby state park and went on one of the trails there. It started out by a parking lot and goes down by the creek, and is a pretty steep climb. Along the way you see all kinds of beautiful rock formations, fresh water, runouts, trees and flowers. It had just rained a few days back, so it was pretty muddy, but we were going at pretty good speed. Now it's good to note that my dad always carries, just for emergencies gear, a folding utility knife and a flashlight on him when we go on the trails. He usually just leaves it in his pockets, but as we finally came to the low point of the trail by the creek, he pulled the knife out of his pocket. I didn't see anything, and he didn't even look like he'd seen something, so I decided not to ask, but I could immediately tell that something was off. I was very mindful as we walked the trails to the other end before the climb. I got this dull fear that sat in the pit of my gut the whole time. I could almost be sure someone was watching me, but I refused to turn around out of fear that would confirm my suspicions. A few yards from the point, my dad pulled out his knife. I began seeing shadows from the corner of my eyes. They were shadows that shouldn't have been where they were. My shadow was in front of me, my dad's in front of him, so I tried to convince myself they were just the shadows of plants. But I know the trails of the state park better than the back of my hand, and I know them by heart, and those shadows weren't supposed to be there. I shook it off and kept moving. About 5 minutes later I heard voices, really quiet, hushed and whispery kind of voices. Just the sound of them chilled me to my core. I couldn't pick up what was being said, but I heard a few phrases like, "Oh, come to me, look." And I heard a few sharp shushes that no natural plant life, wind or animal could ever make. The nearest campsite was about a 3-mile walk through dense vegetation from us. The parking lot was the way back to the start of the trail. So far, we couldn't even hear the cars from the nearby highway, let alone the cars at the parking lot. I know my dad had to have heard it, because he started walking faster the second the voices started. He began jogging, and I with him. We finally made it to the climb back up, and he put his hand on my shoulder. He told me to just climb up the side and use the rocks and branches to help me from slipping in the mud, and to not turn or look around. He said I would lose balance and fall if I did. I thought it was a load of crap. The climb was steep, but it wasn't that bad. I never had to lift my leg higher than my mid-shin for the next step. From there we climbed out and made it back to the mouth of the trail. The sound of rustling in the trees kept us moving fast and was never far behind while we climbed out. My dad had his knife unfolded, and we more or less sprinted to the car. Usually after our hikes, we hang out for a bit in the parking lot, stretching and drinking water, drying off with hand rags, and changing into dry shirts and hoodies, checking for ticks. We usually just decompress for a while before our 20-minute drive home. But today as we approached his car, he folded his knife and tucked it back into his pocket, and told me to get in and buckled up, so I did. My eyes were glued to the road in front of us the whole drive out of the park. Once we were out and back on the back road highway, we both eased up. We pulled over at an empty gas station, and we did what we usually do. Checked each other for ticks, towel dried our sweat, joked about how caked in mud we were, changed clothes and everything. We went in and brought some water and snacks, and got back in the car for the ride home. During the ride, we were mostly joking and talking like we usually do, but as we made it back to our town, he nodded at me and said very seriously, "It followed us down that trail. I didn't want to scare you, I'm sorry." I just nodded, and that was the end of it. We've been to the state park, even on that specific trail, countless times, and something like this has never happened before. I don't think my dad plans to ever go back to that trail at the state park. Safe to say, we didn't tell my mum. I spent a lot of time at my mother's father's house in the woods of Michigan. My brother and I got lost a lot, but if we could find the train tracks, we could always get back. One time when I was about 8 and my brother 12, he didn't want me bothering him and ran away, leaving me alone in the woods. I was crying and wandering around when I came to a house with 2 horses in a pasture. I went and knocked on the door for help. This ancient-looking lady, who looked a bit like a librarian, answered and looked really shocked. I whined about my brother leaving me. She told me to stay at the door while she went back in for something, and then came out to walk me home. I was telling her about the train tracks, and she said she knew where they were at. We get to the tracks, and I'm cheering and pointing in the direction of my grandpa's house. I turned back and she was gone, not a trace of her. I went ahead and crossed the tracks and followed the path to the house. My brother was already back, and they were literally all outside about to go looking for me. Grandma had made dinner, and we all went in to eat. I told Grandma that I wanted to bake cookies for the lady that helped me. She thought that it was one of the neighbors until I said she had 2 pretty horses. Apparently none of the neighbors owned horses. And when I said her house was on the opposite side of the tracks, she said that there were only thick woods there, and that the houses were only on this side of the tracks. I was adamant about where I saw the lady in her house, so the next day Grandma packed up a bunch of sandwiches for a picnic in the woods, and to see where I saw the lady in her house. It was a long walk, but we made it to the pasture, except there was no house and no horses. The only thing in the pasture was my hat that I lost while wandering around before finding the lady's house. We still had our picnic. Not sure if I saw a ghost or the Fae. This story takes place in May 2016. I went camping with my boyfriend at the time, Dennis, and another couple of friends. We decided to drive down to a place called Point Lookout State Park, located at the southernmost point of Maryland. It was a rather large campground with 3 separate loops of campsites. 2 loops were located in a more wooded area, while the loop where we stayed was directly on the water. Our loop was also less crowded, with only 1 other tent set up. I should mention that Point Lookout is a very flat piece of land on the Chesapeake Bay, much of the place being marshland. There was also a neat old lighthouse a very short drive from the loop. Anyway, I didn't look up anything about the area before going in. I was just happy to have a little vacation, as I was going through a hard time in my life. We pitched camp at the most perfect spot on the loop. It was directly on the water, but far enough from the road to not be seen by other people, with a curtain of tall grass guarding the view from anyone else. Basically, it was the perfect spot to drink and smoke weed without being bothered. This was actually my first time camping, and Dennis wasn't very into it either, so we pitched a pretty pathetic loose tent, but it didn't matter since we were barely in the tent except to sleep. We walked around and checked out the area for a bit, walking through the calming loops and along the shoreline. The whole area gave me a slightly weird feeling that I can't describe, like a solemn silence that also felt very heavy. At one point I broke off from the group to use the bathroom facility. As I was walking along the trail, I saw a huge terrapin tortoise walking across the path directly in front of me. As it walked, it kind of made eye contact with me, and didn't break it. It wasn't a terribly strange experience, but again it just felt off. When I came out of the bathroom, the tortoise was gone, even though it was walking extremely slowly. The first night was uneventful beside the extreme wind that blew through the park. As I said, the park is located right on the bay on very flat land, so it's a frequent experience. Unfortunately, since I pitched the most mediocre and loose tent, it blew around all night and felt like it was going to lift from the ground and take us with it. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. The second day, we decided to explore the old lighthouse. It was their spring season, so they had open tours for a few hours during the day. There was a tour guide who gave the history of the house and gave some really cool facts about it. One thing the guide seemed to breeze right over, but struck me, was that the man who built the house along with the two owners died very shortly after living in it. The guide treated that little fact like it was nothing. We continued to hike, drink, smoke, and do all other camping shenanigans and having a great time. It was time to go to bed, and this is where things get strange. This night wasn't windy at all. In fact, it was dead silent, but an eerie silence that puts you on edge. I eventually got to sleep pretty quickly despite this, considering I barely slept the previous night. Not long after, I sunk into a deep sleep, when Dennis wakes me up looking concerned. "Babe, did you hear that?" "No, I was asleep. What happened?" "I heard someone yell, 'Hey,' outside our tent. I think there's a man." I didn't think much of it at first. I thought it was just the other couple talking to each other since their tent was pretty much right next to ours. But then I heard our friends snoring, which meant that they were fast asleep and obviously not talking to each other or us. I was still skeptical about Dennis hearing anything. We were drunk and smoking all night, so it could have just been paranoia. That is, of course, until I heard the footsteps circling around our tent. It was the sound of heavy boots making their way along the gravel. The steps had a little clanking sound like one of those old-timey steel boots. This was no paranoia. We both looked at each other and thought, who the hell was at our tent, and what did they want? The mesh window of our tent was open, and we could see outside around us. We watched above and around, following the sound of the footsteps with our eyes, but never seeing a person. I got chills until the sound made its way back down the path, and eventually disappeared. Dennis and I looked at each other and just said, "The hell was that?" We left the next day as planned, and we told our friends what happened. They were fast asleep and didn't hear a thing, which isn't surprising. These two could sleep through a tornado. This is where the story came together. When I got home, I decided to research the park. Suddenly, everything made sense. Point Lookout was once a Civil War prisoner camp. Buried all around the park were the bodies of Confederate soldiers. The prison housed prisoners in horrible conditions and was considered constantly overcrowded. There are stories of torture at the camp, and even in the basement of the lighthouse. The ghost sightings were abundant from others, many stating that they've heard or seen prison guards patrolling the area, even questioning some of the park's guests. I was convinced that was what we experienced that night. The sound of heavy boots, the loud hey, seemed to match the other descriptions. There are also stories of people seeing a woman walking around on the shore of the beach. She comes up to ask people where her headstone is and if they can help her find it. Turns out there is a woman buried in a nearby cemetery whose headstone was in fact stolen. It was found in a hotel in Washington, D.C. 50 years later and was never put back. I can only assume that she's going to walk the shoreline until they do return it. I was going out alone for a hike in the wilderness in an area that only me and my cousin knew about, and I passed by a really old building. It had some very old, dusty photos of a man and a woman in one of the windows from the communist era, and I was thinking to myself about how they're probably dead now. I made a mental note to myself for no particular reason. After that, I got a very weird vibe for the whole hike. I've done this hike hundreds of times in the past. When night fell, I started to head back home. I had a small flashlight on me, which I was using to get back, to make sure I didn't step on anything or fall. As I was coming home, through a different remote spot on a hill, with no buildings or path or anything like that, never used by people, just wilderness, far from town, I kid you not, right behind me in the grass, I heard a literal music box start playing a tune as I was walking. I could hear it while I walked, and when I stopped walking to listen to it better, I heard it clearly for a split second, and then suddenly it stopped, almost like it knew I'd stopped to listen for it. It scared me. I started looking around and I couldn't find it anywhere. Not in the grass, not in a tree, but the sound came from the exact area I was searching in. It was very near. It just stopped mid-song. I didn't hear it again. I ran home terrified, because I've never had something like this happen to me. And I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal, but this really made me scared. I recognized the tune of the song. It was French. It's Frère Jacques. Our French teacher used to sing it to us in the 4th grade to make us relax. She died of a heart attack in the 6th grade, and my PE teacher at the time also died of lung cancer shortly after. I don't know what to make of that night. The moment I heard the music playing in the middle of nowhere right next to me in real life, I just stopped moving and thought to myself, "You've got to be kidding me. This isn't happening." I was also alone in that whole area and for the whole trip. It left me freaked out. I never heard it again during other hikes, and no one of my friends or cousins or anyone commented anything about it. I don't think it was a setup. I'm 100% sure it wasn't in my head, because I was hearing it while walking through the grass and shrubs, and when I stopped, I kept hearing it clearly from behind me. I don't drink alcohol, I don't do drugs, I don't take medication of any sort. I'm just baffled. As a child, I grew up in Sydney, southwest Australia, in a suburb called Rosemeadow. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? Well, there are no roses, and half of the suburb is housing commission, and was known for being a rough area. Nevertheless, I enjoyed my childhood, and me and my friends made the most out of what we had. So we spent a lot of time playing in the local bushland. We rode bikes, made tree swings, caught frogs, and just explored. I dare say I know that bushland like the back of my hand. There was never really anything eerie about the bush, except for the fact that there was a nursing home located on the western side of the bush, upon a large hill called Kilbridge Nursing Home, which security patrolled, and we got chased out of that section of bushland a few times. Behind the nursing home were a catacomb-like structure of buildings, as if they were going to construct another building but never got around to finishing it. We explored these random concrete foundations with cave-like, half-dirt, half-brick structures. It seemed like people used to hang out here or even sleep here, as we found canned food, some old dirty bongs, old clothes, and just random stuff. Life goes on. It's 2003 now and I'm 14 years old. I dabbled with weed and thought it would be an awesome idea if me and my 2 friends pitched a tent on the western side of the bushland further down the valley from the nursing home, as we weren't too close to the security car patrol paths. I think we bought a $40 tent from Kmart, and about 4 p.m. we hiked to the chosen location to set up the tent before the sun went down. I managed to get some weed, had a bong, and it was all 3 of our first times properly smoking. We were all excited, as I imagine most kids would be when they're about to experience something new and exciting. We did not tell anyone about our plans, as we knew we were going to experiment with drugs and didn't want anyone, including our parents, to find out. The sun went down, and I remember we had a little fire going, and we all had a cone each. My friends were deep in conversation, and my mind drifted off as I suddenly felt a presence around us, as if someone was watching us. My ears pricked up and I felt super sensitive, thinking I could hear rustling in the distance, but wasn't quite so sure. My 2 friends were having a great old time, giggling like schoolgirls as they sat across the fire from me. Blame it on the weed, but I got paranoid and flailed my arms around and sternly let out a shh to my friends. They looked at me like, what the hell? And I whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before I could finish my sentence, an eerie voice howled from the darkness, piercingly loud. "I know where you are." Kind of sounded like someone on crack. I was shocked and glared at my friends to gauge their reactions, because surely they had just heard it too. And yup, after about 2 seconds of all of us frozen in shock, we all jolted up and our instincts had us running back towards the nursing home to exit the bushland. While running, I saw a large dark silhouette figure of what resembled someone in a cloak, like a Grim Reaper, standing on top of the catacomb half-built infrastructures as we ran through the valley. When I saw the figure, my mind was flooded with questions and confusion, but there was no way I was going back to investigate this further. We finally reached the exit of the bushland and looked back in relief and confusion at the bush, in which point we all saw a white apparition at the bottom of the hill, coming towards us. We continued to run back to my house as it was nearby. I got affirmed by my friends that what had just happened had indeed occurred, and we all experienced it. Pretty sure we just slept at my house that night, not wanting to return to the bush until the sun came up. The next day we went back to the tent and cleaned up our mess, and although we had a bad experience during the night, playing in the bush was our thing, so we continued to do it during the hours of daylight. As we were playing by the tree swing, which was about 15 meters away from where we had the tent that night, we suddenly hear the shrieks and screams of what sounds like a young girl, followed by "help me," and then the sound of someone starting up a chainsaw. I looked over the mound of where the tree swing was, but couldn't see much through the thick shrub. I don't even think people could get to the side of the bush, as there was no flat ground or pathway, just thick bushland. Once again, I ran back to my house and got my dad to bring my dog to come and help us look. What was very bizarre was when we reached my house, there was an old Chinese man riding his bike around the front, who wore a bucket as a helmet on his head. I'd seen the guy around town before, and just thought how strange it was that he wears a bucket on his head. But this time he was riding right near my house, circling it almost, and gave me a look that made me feel very uncomfortable. We took my dog down to the bush again and found nothing. These experiences have made me wonder and think sometimes and even question me and my friend's sanity. Could we have all gone through the same psychosis? Was someone having fun at our expense? Who yelled out at us? Who was the girl screaming? Was there an actual crazed maniac with a chainsaw ready to slaughter her? Does the nursing home perhaps hold some dark energies or entities that play tricks on people nearby? To this day, I don't know the truth. It was all very strange, but if anyone has any advice on what it could have been, I'm all ears. This happened in my village 3 years ago. It's located in a rural area that's protected by the government because it has been considered a natural paradise for the last 30 years. This means that exploration in this area is quite difficult nowadays, as it's forbidden to cut trees. So as you can imagine, it's a huge forest. I was spending my summer there, and my favorite thing was going hiking. Although I had never gone alone into the woods, just roads with people. My grandma had told me that cleaning services had opened and rehabilitated a path that had been covered in bushes and trees for the last 30 years because of a race that was being prepared. Usually I'd go to the nearest town about an hour away by foot, by the only way I knew, the road. On my way back from seeing my friends there, I took the new path that my granny had told me about. I thought I was safe as I was alone. The first part of the path was the easiest, a lot of obstacles and landslides, but it was nothing compared to the rest. The second part was a hill full of rocks. That was the hardest thing to go up. Literally, I had to climb on 4 legs like a dog. When I reached the top, I look around and find some animal bones. I didn't pay much attention to it, since the area is known for its big population of wolves and bears that go out at night. I continued my way faster than before. This part was plain floor, so it was a relief until I got to a dead end. Some huge trees had fallen exactly onto a row on the path, and it was impossible to cross them. This seemed really off to me because there was no other fallen trees. The weirdest part? Aside those trees was a little barn in the middle of the woods. I thought to myself it was probably abandoned, as it looked it, so I decided to throw my bag into the little field that belonged to the barn, and then I crossed the fence. I crossed it running without realizing the most bizarre thing. That field had no trees in it. It was clear, no bushes, no big plants, no nothing. It really shouldn't be that way if it was abandoned. I started feeling concerned about how the location of the fallen trees was so coincidental, how there casually was a barn with a clear field when the path had been closed for 30 years. It seemed really off. I went on, and luckily I was just reaching the last hill my grandma had described, the one that connected with the village. Suddenly there was a silence in the woods, which allowed me to hear some branches cracking behind me. I thought to myself it must be a bird, but then it came closer, and it sounded like footsteps. After trying to convince myself it probably was an animal, I started walking faster, and guess what? So did the footsteps. I started running after I noticed that, and the footstep did so too. I was running for my life at this point. Suddenly I began hearing incredibly loud grunts, and everything was going really fast. Luckily I got to my village in a minute or so after that. I got into the patio of the first house I found and closed the door, as it was a relative's house. I stayed there for 10 minutes until I got my breath back, and then just went home. I get chills remembering that place, not having signal in the middle of nowhere and the grunts. It makes me think there was something following me, since the barn and the trees were just a distraction to slow me down. I never went into the woods again alone after that. This is a story that happened to my father when he was a teenager in high school. My father had to walk for at least 5 kilometers every day to get to school. This was in the 1960s. Motor vehicles are very rare in the rural areas. He always took a shortcut through the woods. One morning a farmer saw him just walking back and forth through an area in the woods. The farmer shouted to call his attention, and my father snapped back to reality. My father claimed that a row of very tall trees had been blocking his path, and he could not find a way out of the woods. This was not the first time it happened to someone in the area. It was believed that a playful spirit could trick people by giving them illusions. Some accounts even say that some people got lost in the woods for days, only to be found asleep or dead on the ground. I passed through that area several times. It's mostly rice paddies now, but I've never experienced anything similar. This all happened about a year ago. My friend Maggie and I rented an Airbnb cabin in Felton with the intent to explore Santa Cruz. This was our first time spending overnight in the area, and my friend Maggie is very susceptible to feeling energies and presences, and actually practices magic in her own home. Lately, odd things have been happening to us while we're together, and I'm starting to think it's a pattern. We had plans to microdose some psychedelic mushrooms in the cabin, but both decided not to once we arrived. She explained that upon arrival, she felt a weird vibe inside. Not malevolent, just off. Neither of us felt comfortable doing this there. We decided to check out Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. The hike was beautiful. I was in awe with how tall the redwoods are. I always seem to forget. And we start walking near the river. About 30 minutes into the park, she's behind me, and I hear her shift her positioning, followed by a small scream. I assumed she saw a small snake or a bug, but she told me that she had heard footsteps clear as day running up behind her. Heavy boot-like, pounding footsteps, so loud and close to her ear that she thought she wouldn't have time to move out of the way for them. But when she turned around, that them wasn't there. There was no one. There was nobody on any part of the trail around us. We head back to the cabin slightly spooked, and go to bed around 2:30 a.m. after drinking and talking all night. We are still a little spooked by the feeling of the cabin too, and decided to share a bed that night. It was extremely dark, even with the giant triangle window that looked out into the woods. Luckily, I brought a small plug-in nightlight from home. I ended up having a nightmare that night. In my dream, everything looked as it did before I fell asleep. My nightlight was still plugged in. In the bedroom, there was a mirror on the wall across from me that looked into a dark bathroom next to me. In my dream, in the mirror, I could see a dark figure standing there. Thinking this is all real, I clutch my blanket and try not to look towards the mirror. I assumed this must be my imagination and tiredness because I was still awake in my dream. Next thing I know, the bed starts shaking like an earthquake. It's happening. And I start yelling, "Who are you? What lives here?" indicating my assumption that whoever was in the room with me wasn't human. Then I woke up, grateful it was just a nightmare. The next morning, Maggie tells me she had a dream last night too. She said that a heavy-set lady walked into the cabin and was yelling at us to get out, that we should have packed up and left already. There was a strong sense of urgency in her voice. Either we're unwelcome, or she was trying to protect us. I never knew about Santa Cruz's rich history about being the murder capital of America in the 70s. I did some deep diving after I arrived home and found out that a group of boys were murdered a long time ago on the Henry Cowell Trail we were hiking on, where my friend heard the footsteps. She wondered if they were the echoes of the boys running away, or if it was the spirit that killed them. We found out that 9 years ago a body of a 20-year-old man was discovered on Zayante Road, literally the street across from where we were staying in the name of the creek in our backyard. I'm curious to see if anyone else has experienced anything like this. I know that Yosemite is also a hotspot for this type of energy. Could it be cursed due to everything terrible that's happened here? Please let me know. I'm intrigued to say the least. I have a story to share with you. Some of you may see it as a mere chain of coincidences. Maybe it is something, but I'll preface this by saying I do not believe my house or the nearby area to be haunted. I've lived here for a few years, and I've never had experiences before this. I never get a solid night's sleep either. I have 4 kids, and I'm used to hearing one of them wake up and call for me. Sometimes I wake up to the sweet pitter-patter of toddler feet across the kitchen floor at 2 a.m. I'm a very light sleeper after all. If this matters to the validity of the experience, I don't take any medication, drink or smoke. I have normal dreams, have only had sleep paralysis twice in my life, and nothing interesting ever happens to me. That being said, the following experiences could use an explanation. Let's see what you make of them. Last week, I awoke to hearing my daughter call out, "Mom!" Confused, I went into half-asleep autopilot mode and got out of bed. Everyone was fast asleep. Then I realized why I felt confused. I'd heard 2 voices call for me at the same time. It sounded like my daughter, but in 2 different tones. Not like how a penguin sounds, but like I heard "mum" twice. The second mum starting a second after the first, but noticeably not at the same time. But to make matters creepy, my daughter wasn't even home. She was at her nana's house, and she rarely calls for me anymore because she's 8 and a big girl now. I figured I completely dreamt it, or maybe my son called for me in his sleep and my brain distorted it. In any case, I went back to bed. In the morning, I was loading up the kids to drive my boyfriend to work. I put my 5-year-old in first, as he was awake enough to start buckling up himself. I slid the door mostly closed because I have this outlandish fear that a Sasquatch will come and grab my kid from the car when I'm not looking. Me and my boyfriend came back out with the other 2 kids and got them situated. It's then that my 5-year-old son tells me that he heard someone laughing in the yard when I'd gone inside. That freaked me out. I quickly worked on leaving. It was just before twilight, and our porch light doesn't really make it around the corner of the house where the car is. We have a chicken wire fence, jerry-rigged along the side of where the car is parked from the end of my house to the driveway gate. It needs a 3rd stake as the middle of the fence can flop over sometimes. It's usually when the kids intentionally pull it down to grab the ball they lost, or just to be kids. I tripped over the fence. It was too dark to see that it had fallen. I thought that was strange. It wasn't like that before bed that night. My bedroom window is directly in front of my car and the fence, so I usually know its state. But who could knock over the fence when the driveway was open and accessible? I figured perhaps an exceptionally big squirrel that did it on a midnight trip. On the drive, I asked my son about the laughter he heard. He said he heard it outside of his head, and that it came from the climb and slide toy, and it sounded like a boy was laughing with a sore throat. On the way home, my son fell asleep. I heard him make a noise in his sleep. The ambient noise was so loud, I couldn't tell if he giggled or whimpered. I called his name and asked him if he was dreaming about laughing, and he said that yes, and that it was funny. I was relieved by this. My son is pretty sensitive and would be scared if he dreamt about something creepy. He was creeped out by the laugh he heard, but he seemed fine after that. When we got home, it was the beginning of dawn. I sat in the car until there was sufficient light, and I let the dog out first. Uncharacteristically, he began running all around the yard with his nose to the ground. He went to areas he normally doesn't scout. I told myself he sensed my uneasiness and wanted to be a thoroughly good boy. Nothing else happened that morning or since. It still creeps me out to think about it, and I won't go outside in the dark by myself. My boyfriend brought up the idea of skinwalkers. He came from New Mexico, but we don't have Navajo up here in Washington. It's probably all in my head, right? I mean, we live in quite a rural area. Could it be something in the woods coming out? In any case, I don't know what to believe. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Well done for making it to the end of the video. You guys are my secret audience, the ones who make it to the end. And if you made it this far, it's safe to say you hopefully enjoyed this, and what would be great would be leaving a like and subscribing if you're not already for new content every other day. Don't forget to press the bell icon for good measure, guys. I hope that you liked today's video. I certainly did. Haunting Woods is certainly creepy. I appreciate the last two stories weren't super specifically woodsy, but yeah, it happened around the woods. I hope that I can be forgiven. But yeah, good fun topic as always, guys. As always, a huge thanks also to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on the screen. It really does mean a lot to get your continued support, so thank you guys. But I think I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope that you liked the sound effects and stuff. I really am trying to put in a bit more effort. And do let me know what you think about the screen as well, if you don't like the visuals and stuff, or if you do. But I'm trying to keep it as dark as possible. Anyway, let's wrap things up here for now, guys. Take care, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one on Friday.